We were talking just a few moments ago about Audrey Parker and her story, which is back in the news today. We certainly talked about it as a country when she died of breast cancer back in the fall. In November, she opted for a legally assisted death, and she had been approved for that. But you remember what happened prior to her death. She spoke publicly, very candidly, about feeling that she'd been forced to die too early, earlier than she'd wished, because of a clause, a provision in the law, that people be mentally competent at the moment they give that final consent for physician-assisted death. It's called specifically a clause of late-stage consent rule. And today, Dying with Dignity Canada is launching a campaign in Audrey's honor, calling for an amendment to the legislation in hopes of getting rid of that clause. I want to talk more about this with someone who was there in the final moments of Audrey Parker's life, a very close friend of hers, Kim King, who is with me from Halifax this morning, an advocate as well for assisted dying. Kim, thank you very much for being with us as our guest today.
Good morning, Heather.
Good morning to you. I mentioned the legislation as it exists. Can you tell me in your words what you think is wrong with the legislation as it exists currently?
Right. Well, the legislation, there's a flaw in the law in the fact that late-stage consent takes away the patient's control over where, pardon me, Heather.
Okay.
It takes away their ability to control their end-of-life experience. And when we consider the issue of Audrey Parker, you know, Audrey never feared death, but what she feared was the getting to the dying. And it was so important to have that control over her end of life. And when we realized, you know, when the cancer potentially could move to her brain and that she could lose capacity, mental capacity, as you mentioned, or consciousness, you know, invoking MAID would be lost. It's not possible. And so what we're fighting for today is what we're calling Audrey's Amendment, which is what she spoke about so passionately before her death and is the subject matter of the video to call on lawmakers to amend this law.
And we are definitely going to take a look at that a little bit later on. So because, again, she feared that she was going to be incapacitated, not able to give that final consent, she was going to be denied that, and it was better to die earlier than she wanted than to be able to have that assistance at the time of death. And she talked about that so publicly. And so you're launching, as part of this campaign, the online petition. What are you specifically going to be calling for, Kim?
So in Audrey's amendment with the petition, you can go on to dyingwithdignity.ca and people can sign up for that. We're asking for late-stage consent to be removed. And Dying with Dignity has, of course, expert legislators who are working on what that language might be. But in layman terms, it would be a very simple amendment to the law. When a patient is going through the approval, the process to be assessed and approved, they would make just a second step, a simple patient declaration that would cover off the fact that they still would want MAID invoked should they lose capacity. And that would be so valuable because, you know, Heather, from the family perspective, you know, to know that you would have your loved one's wishes carried out regardless of capacity is so comforting both to the patient and to the families.
You know, this will reopen the discussion that we had back in the fall. I remember it so well, and you'll know there are those who have a differing point of view, who are concerned about what it would mean to remove this provision. Let's bring up a couple of things. For example, at the time of Audrey's death, the health minister, Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor, talked about how saddened she was for her loved ones and for Audrey in her specific case. She did say, though, that she wants a law for all Canadians. She didn't want to change the law based on her specifics. Again, going on to say that she needs a law in this situation that would cover all Canadians. And there are those who are concerned about Canadians with vulnerabilities, Canadians with dementia, Canadians who, without these safeguards, you know, there could be inappropriate motives that could lead to an improper end for them, change their moment of death. And I'm just going to play a little clip that we'll talk about. One of the members of the expert panel who's been looking and looked into this particular part of the legislation is Tim Stainton. And at the time of Audrey's death, he was on this program, and this is what he said. Let's listen together.
We don't know if that's exactly what the person would choose at that time. and a decision that absolutely cannot be reversed. So that the problem of uncertainty creates a vulnerability for virtually anyone, but particularly for those who may be viewed as a life others wouldn't want to live. So people with dementia, people with disabilities.
So that just gives you a taste of, again, some of the people who raise concerns about getting rid of this clause, that people could change their perspectives, people could be exploited. When you hear those and you'll know them well, how do you respond to that? Why should the law be changed anyway?
I have a very clear and simple response to that, and that is the fact that we are talking only about the assessed and approved category. Some of the things that he's mentioned, he's talking about patients with dementia, those kinds of things. The category in which Audrey Parker fell, she had already gone through the rigorous screening process. She had met with 2 independent doctors, and anybody who is in this category who are assessed and approved, their death is imminent, they are experiencing excruciating pain. They're not changing their minds. This is a clear-cut amendment to a law for a group of people who are already assessed and approved, and that's the important thing that we all have to keep in mind. When you're reading about this amendment, we are only talking about that category of people. We're not talking about dementia. We're not talking about mature minors. Those are more complex cases. This is straightforward. It's people who have made a clear decision and they have been approved. They've already been granted the ability to invoke MAID. So why would the government ever think that somebody would change their mind when they are in such a grievous state, a state of pain, a state of decline? It makes no sense. It's an easy legislative change, and it will impact so many people. There's Audrey Parkers happening all over the country right now who are experiencing similar circumstances, who are going to potentially lose out on precious days, weeks, months of life. And we believe strongly that the government does not want that, and we want to do everything we can to strongly and with some power and strength to let them know that this is just wrong.
You make such a powerful case yourself, but the words of Audrey Parker and her image do as well. And as you mentioned, and I'm just saving this for the end, a part of your campaign today is to release a video, and this is something that I understand, Kim, she recorded obviously knowingly prior to her death to continue to enable you to continue her fight. So it's a 3-minute video. We're not going to play all of it, but here's a short clip of Audrey Parker and her final message.
I can assure you that no one chooses death lightly. We just don't want to suffer anymore. Anyone who is suffering like I am, you can't even imagine the level of pain that I endure. My last wish is that you, my fellow Canadians, that you will help people who've been assessed and approved to live without fear of their rights being taken away.
So looking at that as her friend, it must be hard to see her there on screen, so recent still after her death. But her words are powerful. Why do you think it's important that we hear from Audrey Parker herself on this?
Well, she was the advocate for this. She was the person that put this flaw in the law, that brought it to light. And when we started working with Dying with Dignity, it was so important to help that message. And, Audrey never saw herself as an advocate, and it was surprising to her in this last part of her life. But she was so proud to think that, that her death would mean something, that would stand for something and would help other Canadians avoid this very difficult, heart-wrenching decision that she had to make. And we are very proud of her.
Well, and I dare say she would be very proud of you for taking up her challenge and her cause, as I said so eloquently. The whole video is going to be up on Dying with Dignity's site later on today. And Kim King in Halifax, thank you for being my guest today.
Thanks, Heather.